Hello everyone, I hope you're having a fantastic day and a wonderful week. Welcome to another episode of We Aren't Dead Yet. I'm Emily Armstrong, creator of the ttrpg system Quests and Quarrels, as well as the settings Beckett Build, Culinary Punk, and Elder Space. I'm here with Dazz the Cat.
Hello, I am Dazz the Cat. I am the creator of the ttrpg Meaty Bones, as well as the worlds of Pangorio and Hypnosium. I am here with Sapha.
Hi there, my name is Sapha Burnell. I'm a best-selling cyberpunk and mythpunk author and an editor for a small press. I've been in the fiction sphere for more than 15 years, and I'm going to remind everybody today, don't worry, there's always something we can do, because we aren't dead yet.
Fallout falls into this weird kind of space where Skyrim and Elder Scrolls were the big thing for Bethesda. That's what people know Bethesda. Like, everybody knows Skyrim. I think that's that's a big, big game. And Fallout was kind of like the little cousin of Skyrim, because not as many people knew about it, but it was still a really big game franchise. It had a huge audience, but it wasn't as publicly known as things like Skyrim was. There were a lot more memes about Skyrim that were in the public-facing sphere. I think the Fallout TV show has really brought it into the forefront, I guess you could say, of Bethesda stuff, because you don't really see all that much about Elder Scrolls nowadays. People are still playing Skyrim, people still love Skyrim, and many of the other Elder Scrolls games that have come out before and since. But I do think we're going to see a big surge in Fallout becoming a bigger franchise, a bigger series for people, because there is a lot in there to pull inspiration from and get excited by, and there's almost something for everybody. I unfortunately think that there are some roadblocks for some people that they just won't be able to get into it because of certain things. But in the newer games, I think the newer games are probably a little easier to get into than some of the older games. New Vegas in particular, I'll get into later, but had the Wild Wasteland perk that you could pick up that made things just wild. I might get into some of the things, but it added extra gore and some extra things that popped up in the wasteland. And I think a lot of the more extreme stuff from the show was really pulling from that kind of vibe. I believe that the creators of the show are big fans of New Vegas. I won't say any spoilers for the show, but based on the vibe that I get from the show, that's what I believe. Fallout was one of those games that I got into in high school that felt like one of the first games that I could play without needing to go watch a walkthrough of it. Because a lot of the games I was watching walkthroughs of were horror games that I was too scared to play myself. Or games that I knew I wanted to play, but either couldn't afford or didn't have other people to play with, so there was no point in me getting the game, and it was fine just watching it. But Fallout was the first game I felt like I could play on my own without needing anybody else to help me enjoy it. And even though there were scary parts in it, it didn't feel like I needed somebody else there to go through those scary parts with me, because I felt brave enough at that point to go through it on my own. And it became a huge inspiration for me, specifically because of, I think, going through it alone so often. It is a single-player game until we get into one of the recent releases, Fallout 76, which was an online multiplayer game. There are tons of opinions online about Fallout 76. I think now most people would think, if they played it nowadays, that it is a pretty good game. But when it first came out, oh boy. Releasing an online game for people who have been playing multiple games as single player was a big hurdle in the first place, but there were a lot of other issues with the game. I enjoyed it. It was a fun game. I haven't played it in a while. I think I'll probably dive into it because I haven't played it since they added NPCs. And if you're wondering why I'm saying added NPCs like that, it's because the game originally didn't have any. There were no other human survivors outside because it was essentially Reclamation Day, and you were all supposed to be leaving your vault and going to reclaim the wasteland. And they didn't really have wasteland people to talk to and do things because nobody was there yet. And they eventually added Wastelanders, which also had some mixed reviews. But I could talk about Fallout 76 for quite some time. I won't get into it because it was not one of my big inspo Fallouts. For me, it really started with New Vegas, was the first one that I played well over a decade ago at this point. But I think a lot of people's introduction to Fallout nowadays is going to be the new Fallout TV show. There's something that feels almost satirical in a way about Amazon producing the Fallout series, because I've personally always seen Amazon as sort of our world equivalent of like a Vault Tech. So I'm like, there's just something funny to me about Amazon being the ones to pick up the series, the Fallout series, because of that. Fallout itself, it's a fun game. There's a lot of humor. I laugh every time I play Fallout. The comedy and the writing itself is always fantastic. Even with all of that like lighthearted humor and stuff, it takes place in this very, very dark setting, and Fallout doesn't pull away from that dark at all. Sort of leans into it in a lot of points. And the show really did that in such a fantastic way. I think that the Fallout TV show by Amazon really captured that Fallout vibe almost perfectly. And I only say almost because at the moment, I couldn't think of a better way that they could capture that vibe. I do think they could have pulled back on some of it a little bit to make it more accessible to audiences, like I said, but I also get why they didn't.
I mean, if you're looking at it from the perspective of somebody who's not a fan of the Fallout series, I plead ignorance on Fallout. Like, I've never played it. I've seen ads for the game. That's it. That's all I knew about Fallout until I met this wonderful eldritch being. So if there was fan service that was so in your face, I think it probably just skipped right by me, to be honest, because if you don't know what you're looking for and you see somebody like winking at the screen, well, you know that somebody winked at a screen, but you don't really necessarily know what that was for. You know, unless you have somebody explaining to you the secret codes or why that, 2 seconds in front of the vault as they're opening the doors while she's in a shared wedding dress. If you're thinking that I'll suddenly be like, oh, divine inspiration, I understand where that comes from now. That's not the case. The Fallout show, I don't think necessarily fills people in who have zero idea what's going on. I mean, it's pretty easy to be like, oh yeah, Earth go boom. Okay, these people have been living in a vault. All right, okay, here we go. Now go find daddy. Like, that part of it is very well done. I think they did a really good job on the production value with Fallout, the TV show. I also think that they cast it really well. I think that all of the actors did a fantastic job of their performances. I stopped watching at the second episode.
Yeah. And if you've watched Fallout, everybody knows exactly. If you say the second episode, pretty much everybody will know exactly why. So I think it's totally valid for people to not want to continue watching the Fallout show after that. It's not exactly the most comforting show. There are a lot of things in Fallout that are really, cute, cozy in a way. There's a lot of cozy in the Fallout series, not the TV series, but the Fallout IP media as a whole. There's a lot of really great, good vibes. Like, I know I talked a little down on Fallout 76, but one of the coziest things you can do in Fallout 76 is get a bunch of friends together in the post-apocalypse with your instruments and chill out on somebody's homemade porch that you put together yourself and just jam out. Like, nobody's talking on a voice chat. You're just playing your little banjos and your little instruments together. And it is like, I don't know how to describe such a cozy little comforting community feel. They really nailed that with Fallout 76. I think that's the kind of vibe that you don't totally get in other games because in Fallout 76, you are rebuilding society with other people, and they're real people that you're helping and like working through the game with. And I haven't played 76 in a while. I think I will go back to it to see how that vibe is feeling nowadays, because I don't know how many people are still playing on the active servers. But I do think they could have leaned a little more into that in the show. I would have liked if they did. The environmental storytelling in Fallout, in the games in particular, was really that thing that pulled me in. And I think that's a little bit what the TV show is missing. Now, I think the TV show does it in an amazing way. In particular, very mild scene spoiler, but not a show spoiler in any way. Lucy is walking out into a house in the wasteland and sees a family of skeletons. And on the table is a Vault-Tec product called Plan D. And that's something new that they added into the TV show. That's not in any of the games. But I think it is this fantastic, tiny, like 5 seconds of environmental world building that sent a chill down my spine the first time I saw it in the show. I was like, whoa, Amazon blowing my expectations out of the water, because one of the best parts of the video game is when you are thinking you're on top of the world, you got a bunch of caps in your pocket, your gun is like, you got all your ammo for your weapon, you're in power armor strolling through the wasteland, nobody can touch you. You go to get some loot out of a house and you realize what happened to the family there by the way the skeletons are laying around the house. And you see skeletons holding suitcases and trying to get out the door. And there are so many pieces in Fallout like that hit you out of nowhere, that even though the game is fun and like just a blast to play, you get hit with these completely surreal, grounding moments almost in this post-apocalypse that reminds you, hey, this is a post-apocalypse. This is a really horrific event happened. Like, you might be having fun, but remember, this is where it all came from. And I think for a game that does have so much light in it, that it reminds you of the horror that humanity can bring with nuclear weapons and really how scary that truly is. And I don't know of another game that does it quite like the Fallout universe does. At least no game has ever hit me the way that the Fallout universe does. And there are tons of really fun, light world-building environmental storytelling that they do. Novak, which is a little motel that is named because the sign used to say no vacancy, but it's all fallen apart in the post-apocalypse and all that's left is Novak. And that's the town name. And there are a ton of little towns that get their names like that. And I think that's just such a fun, like, little way that Fallout does things. Possibly my favorite bit of environmental storytelling from any of the Fallout games was the discovery of the Dunwich Borers site my very first time playing. I had no idea that there was any cosmic horror in Fallout. I knew that there were ghouls, which are sort of Fallout's version of zombies, but they are irradiated humans. I knew that there were things like death claws, and I knew there was a lot of like science-based creatures and things like that. I did not realize that there was a whole cosmic horror element to Fallout hiding just below the surface, literally and figuratively. Well, the first time that I went into Dunwich Borers, I thought that I was just walking down into a mining operation to go loot some bodies. And it turns out that there is an entire cosmic horror cult that you start to not investigate, but you get a couple hints that something is weird in the Fallout universe. I think rather than spoil it, you should play some of the Fallout games, and if you see anything named Dunwich, run towards it. Run towards it, look at everything in the area, read all the books, read everything that you can, because the Ugg-Qualtoth entity within Fallout, I believe, is going to be a much bigger part in the next game. Each game, it has continued to grow more and more. We had the Dunwich Boars, and we had in the Point Lookout DLC, we got into a family searching for a specific book called the Quebecna, and you have to get it back for them, for this old man, and he doesn't seem all that together. I'm trying to think how to put this without putting any major spoilers for anything, but the people who created Fallout really enjoyed the lore of the Lovecraft stories, I believe, because there's a lot of references to the Lovecraft stories in very interesting ways, and none of it is in the foreground. You kind of have to search for all of it. By the way that they have been increasing the visibility of the Ugg-Qualtoth related content, I have a feeling that it's only going to become more and more of a fixture within the universe, because in Fallout 76, although we don't get too much info on the Ugg-Qualtoth situation, at least not as much as we did in like Point Lookout, the Mothman cult worshippers are worshipping an entity called the Interloper below ground, which you can find if you search for it. There's a physical body for the Interloper that has now come into the Fallout universe, which we've never had a physical being before. And I'm just, now that we have a visual of what could potentially be, we have some backstory about a Black Hall family attempting to bring about this entity. Modifius, the ttrpg publisher, has the Fallout ttrpg, which recently released the Winter of Adam, that dives further into a Son of Adam cult, which the Children of Adam are their own cult within the Fallout universe, but they start to tie into this worship of the potential Ugg-Qualtoth entity. There's a lot of interesting information about Ugg-Qualtoth that is coming into the Fallout universe, and I'm excited to see where it goes in Fallout 5. We don't have any information about a Fallout 5, really, but because of the popularity of the Fallout TV show, we have gotten recent news that Microsoft is pushing Bethesda to potentially get Fallout 5 out a little bit faster. And if they do, I think that this will probably be the quickest turnaround for a Fallout game, which has me excited and nervous. I have high hopes. I think they've probably been working on Fallout 5 for quite some time. I have a feeling it's going to go back to its single-player roots. I do not think we'll be doing another multiplayer game in the Fallout series, at least the way that we saw it in Fallout 76 created, anytime soon. But I'm excited to see where it goes. So, for me, if you know anything about the work that I have done, this Ugg-Qualtoth mystery has been a brainworm, and I mean a infestation in my mind. When I was a kid playing Fallout, all I wanted was more Ugg-Qualtoth. I wanted everything, all the information, right then, right there, I needed it. And they just didn't give it to you. And that rotted my mind for years. Until I came out with a little idea for a story called Beckettville, which was essentially my idea of the cosmic horror was really the reason for the apocalypse. And it was using humanity as its tool, rather than it being entirely at the fault of humans. I wanted something behind that major company, making it push the button. And so that's where my whole concept for Beckettville came from. Obviously, Fallout is not the only inspiration. There is a ton of different media that went into the creation of Beckettville and my weird little mind that has created the world of Beckettville. But Fallout really was one of my first big inspirations for greater world building, I think is the way to put it. Because before Fallout, I was aware of world building and how it affected in films and in movies, but I don't think I really realized how much the environment really affects how the story is told. And I think another thing that really brings Fallout to another level of environmental storytelling, and the reason that, because I had been playing video games for years at that point, but I think the reason that Fallout was the one that grabbed me for environmental storytelling is because although it has NPCs and missions that you can do and you can talk to people, there's so much of that story and that world that is never said out loud. I mean, you have a lot of holotapes that you can listen to that are from the past, but I didn't even get a chance to get into, and I won't today, but I could talk for hours just about the terminal entries that you can find in the Fallout series. That's a big, big part of Fallout. The TV show doesn't really get into it because it's not something that you can really show on a TV show well. They show Norm doing his little hacking from the games, which that hacking game he does is from the Fallout game. That was such a nice little nod to the Fallout game. But in the video games, you spend so much time going on to a terminal, like a computer on the game, and reading people's diary entries that lead up to the bomb dropping, and a lot of them end because most people died. And you get to find out what these people's lives were like leading up to what happened, and then you walk around the space that they were in when it happened. And a lot of the times, they were like typing on the computer. Like, there are a lot of times that you can find a computer entry that just stops, and you look around, you realize why it stopped. And that was so chilling to me as a child. I mean, not as a child. I wasn't a child. I was a high schooler when I started playing Fallout. But still, yeah, especially for that kind of storytelling. And that was a big pull. And on top of that, the vaults themselves, most of them, I won't say most of them, a lot of them don't have people in them anymore, at least not people you can talk to and find out what happened. Some of them are filled with hundreds of clones of a man named Gary. And then you have to go through that vault of hundreds of Gary clones trying to kill you, saying, Gary, Gary. I'm trying to find out why there are hundreds of Gary clones. And the worst part about Gary clones is they're out there. And they're still living out there, and they're coming for you. Some of those clones escaped. You can find Gary stuff out in the Fallout wastelands, which means they're out there, people. Gary's coming.
There is no group of media or stories that inspired Waxwing. There's the same way that there's no group of media or stories that inspire the Judge of Mystic saga. I don't look at other forms of media and then go, ooh, that would be cool. What if I did this with my own work? That's not how my mind functions. So this question of things that you find inspiring, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I really love because it was very talented in its creation and things. It's not inspiration. It's not it is inevitable that through the course of being a creator, you will end up putting layers of things into your work that came from other things other than yourself. But for me, I make a very stiff effort with myself to reduce the amount that anybody could say, oh, hey, you got that from this. To the point where I've ditched projects because something came out and it was oh, that's basically my project, just different. Fuck, now I have to ditch this project. And I've done that several times because there was a project we were working on, which is a TV pilot, and it was a horror comedy with a bunch of guys in it. And it was basically a werewolf, and two vampires living together in suburbia. And right as we started pitching the first season of this show, a show came out, which was a werewolf, a vampire, and a ghost living together. And they were like, oh, it's like this. And we were like, what? And they're like, oh yeah, it just came out in England. And I was like, how on earth would we have known that? It's not, I swear we didn't actually know that. And they're like, oh yeah, no, but this show's really good. It's already gotten a lot of press. You're just going to be seen as an imitator. So as much as possible, I try to stay away from things like the Ragnarok series on Netflix. I've never seen it. because people were like, oh yeah, just like your Judge of Mystics thing. I was like, well, nope, can't do that. I stay as like, if I know that something could be entangled with it, I purposely don't watch it. I want my own space. And then it's a way for me to be like, okay, there are going to be similarities between my work and other work. Otherwise, it wouldn't jive at all. But when I think of things that inspired, I think the number one thing that inspired the entire series of books was me struggling with the fact that I had no father. And I wanted to know what it would be like and what it would take for it to be okay that a father abandoned his kid. That was it. That was the entire inspiration for the Judge of Mystic Saga right there. It was, what if my father had a reason, a good reason for not being there? And that created the character of Caleb, who ended up becoming this guy who didn't even know he had a child because reasons, and find out in Book of Revels coming out soon. And then what kind of job, what kind of task would he have that would supersede him realizing that this stuff had taken place in the background? That was the inspiration. Yes, I ended up writing it halfway into a fantasy version of Vancouver. And yes, obviously, I'm using a lot of myths from various places as kind of easy archetypal placeholders so people can connect to them and be like, oh, I understand that's a leprechaun. Okay, great. You know, that kind of thing. Like, obviously, I do have inspiration that way, different folklore and things like that we've talked about a ton. But when I think of like, oh yeah, I just wanted to do a series of projects that were like this specific project. No, I don't have it. There is nothing new under the sun. And that is, for those of you who are like, oh yeah, I've heard that before. Where does that come from? The Bible. You know, Solomon was this figure in the Bible who was supposedly the wisest person ever. And one of the things he said in one of his wisdom books, which is supposed to be this like, look at this philosophy, think of it like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And what it basically means is, if you think that you're doing something original, if you think that you're doing something that's never been done before, you're not researched enough. You know, like, there's never going to be a point where you're like, oh, I made this completely original thing. Well, odds are it did come from somewhere. So yes, I do believe that, you know, we find inspiration in things and that can be very intrinsic and internal. But also, you have to be careful when you're somebody who's a little bit more like me and you're like, well, no, I just kind of invented these things off the top of my head. Well, our mind is a swirling vortex of the subconscious. And if you follow along the lines of Jungian philosophy and things like that, then there is a collective subconscious, you know, this sort of collective subconscious of the culture around you, this idea that all of these people who came before, they're adding things that sort of become part of your soul, that become part of your mind, even without you thinking about it. So for me, art is more about allowing that subconscious to come forward of its own kind of intrinsic will, and less about me looking at a project and going, I want to make something like that. You know, I fell into cyberpunk because, well, you know, William Gibson's The Sprawl trilogy, that was amazing. You know, Count Zero changed my life. And I don't mean that as in if the book was particularly profound. I think there was an interview with William Gibson and he said that if you asked me what the plot line of Count Zero was, I don't think I could fucking remember because that was 30 years ago, dude. Like, you know, he's like, I don't even think I remember this book. And I'm like, but that book changed my life. No, well, it changed my life because I was an impressionable teenager saying goodbye to my favorite teacher. And he handed me that book off his shelf and said, I think you're going to really like this. And it was the first major piece of literature I had been allowed to read. You know, I hid it from my family, which was just rebellious. So did that inspire a love of cyberpunk? Yeah, I wanted to know what grit was like. You know, I wanted to take a look at the society we were in and extrapolate it beyond with that sort of vaporwave cassette core kind of aesthetic behind it. But the question of AI and the question of, you know, different artificial intelligence, the question of corporate overtaking, you know, are we falling into corpocracy right now? And for those of you who don't know, corpocracy or a corporatocracy is basically a government by corporation. And so a little bit like what Emily was talking about with Fallout and things like that. This is one parallel, I think. In cyberpunk, you always have some form of corporate overlord. There's always some form of this is pseudo-governmental, this is the way the world works. Usually by this point, capitalism has taken it all the way to the nth degree, and everybody is either part of a corporation or they're on the fringes of it. And within that structure, you find rebellion. And there is a huge diversity of, socioeconomic statuses and the kinds of technology that are available. You get the really high-end technology with the people that are really close with the corporation in charge, and you get cobbled together tech from the fringes. And just that idea of the fringe, it appealed to me because I've always been in the fringe in a way. Like, we discussed this a little bit when we were trying to figure out how to kind of market my work. I'm not the most wild person in the world. I'm fairly vanilla when it comes to a lot of things. I keep myself to alcohol and ASMR and various music and synesthetic kind of experiences when it comes to altering my mind and things. I'm married. I have a house in the suburbs. I'm, just kind of living life. But I've always been on the outside of any circle that I've tried to enter. I wasn't Christian enough. I wasn't Pentecostal enough for the Pentecostals. I wasn't, secular enough for the secular world. I wasn't into partying enough to make it in the film industry. I wasn't male enough for martial arts. I wasn't female enough for makeup and costume design and things like that. Like, there were always, basically the intersection of every single kind of place I've tried to put myself, I've always been on the outside of it. And so that sort of place of kind of punk rebellion, that sort of carving your own thing out, it's incredibly scary because you're not going to be instantly recognizable from different areas and different places and people. But that was the part that gripped me with punk literature. Did William Gibson, was he the gateway for me to kind of get there? Yeah, I think he was. He was the first one that I ever saw that was doing that kind of thing, followed very closely by Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere. But that one kind of receded in the background for me a bit. Not because Neil Gaiman's not awesome. Like, obviously, it's Neil Gaiman. I mean, come on, anybody remember Sandman? Like, not just the Netflix series, the actual comic. It was freaking fantastic. They got me to a place where I realized that I could be on the fringe and I didn't have to try and change myself to attach to various other places as much as I even wanted to in different times. And that took a long time to learn, but that's more of what reflected it into my work than anything else. And everything else is just, I start a project by taking a look at what question do I want to solve? What do I want to go through? What do I want to philosophically endure while I create this piece of media? Because as somebody who is kind of a strange individual, I know that I will be experiencing emotionally everything that I'm writing. And I have to be very careful about going too far one way or another before I could need a little bit more therapy.
I think it's interesting that you don't go back and, like, if somebody tells you it's similar, that you don't watch it, because I do the exact opposite. Is I will go in and, like, if I think something's similar, I'll deep dive into it and pull it apart and see all the little bits of it just to see if there is a way that I can twist what I'm doing to make it veer off significantly from whatever's happening with the other thing. And that's happened a couple of times with me, especially with Becketville, actually, is when I first launched it, I had a lot of people asking me if it was similar to X, Y, and Z. I had a lot of people, still a lot of people, even though I have dismissed it, that think that Becketville is run by an AI. It is not run by an AI. It is not computer. I promise. I'm not lying to throw you off. It is not AI. It is. I've said it multiple times. It's eldritch. I don't hide that. I put it between the lines, but not really. Like, it's cosmic horror. It's not an AI. I think that's a very interesting concept. But the big reason that I decided absolutely not to go AI is because of Fallout. Because there is a vault in Fallout that's run by a computer. And there are a couple of different situations where it is an AI or a computer that is running a thing in Fallout. And so I was worried that there are a lot of media that is AI or a computer running a thing that people believe that AI is a human until you see it. That's a trope, but
it's a total meme at this point.
It's a trope. Yeah.
I mean, okay, so I should say here, I don't do that, but I know my editor does.
Yeah, that's the thing.
So that's like, I don't do it because my editor will tell, like, I trust my editor to be like, hey, yeah, so you need to change this, this, and this. Oh, really? Why? Don't ask me. Okay, that means it's too similar to something that I'm unaware of. So, okay, yeah, I'll change it. What if I do this? So, like, that situation does happen in the background, but for me, I give that responsibility to my editor instead of myself. So, yeah.
I think that's a fantastic way to do it, because I think that sometimes I get a little too hung up on, like, is it too similar? Oh God, I know this very specific thing and I know I'm pulling inspiration from it, but am I too similar to the inspiration? I think that you have a nice sweet spot where, as long as you have people in your corner who are going to call you out on it and let you know, you're fine to do that. I kind of wish that I was doing that with some things, but a lot of the inspiration that I pull from is really niche, and I also would not ask other people to go watch, but you don't write that kind of content. And like what you do write, you can totally do that. Like, I think that's such a good way to handle it.
I should say, too, obviously, when it comes to myth punk and it comes to retelling folklore and retelling mythology, clearly, if I'm using the character of Ares, yes, I am very well read in the extant mythology and the different stories that we have. Am I doing my own take on who I believe Ares to be? Yes, I am. Am I aware that there's like 7,000 million takes on who Ares is? Yes, I am. So, like, clearly, when it comes to the myth punk stuff, when it comes to the upcoming Agape Maki, which is the first of the Judge of Mystics origin series, it's legit a retelling of mythology. So obviously, I'm very well read on that mythology. It is something that I've studied quite academically. But again, if you've been listening to our podcast for more than 5 minutes, then you're pretty darn aware that mythology is my main academic place of pursuit. So in that regard, it's like, yeah, well, it's mythology, but that's the point of it. Whereas when I go to write, my novels, when I go to write, the Lieben cycle, when I go to write the Judge of Mystics saga, the actual saga of Caleb Malthison, yes, there are those inspirational characters in it. Like Ares does arrive, Aphrodite is in it, there are fae, but my fae are living plants. And although I can probably say that, and then there will be people being like, yes, well, actually the following pieces of literature have fae as living plants as well. And I'm assuming that you are well versed in blah, blah, blah. Well, no, I'm not. But in my idea, it was just that these are basically interdimensional plant sapients. That's what they are.
You do them in such a cool way. Like, even if I can't think of it, like, there are a lot of things that I can think of where it's living plants, obviously, but I can't, in my mind immediately, nothing comes to mind that has that kind of vibe. But the way that you do them is so cool. Like, your twist on them is so unique that it's not like any other work that I've seen. I really like the way you handle fae.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And that was more about botany than anything else. Like, I wasn't inspired, obviously I've read a lot of fairy folklore. I've read a lot of folklore from, the Isles of Ireland and into the United Kingdom and various areas where you do get a tradition of fair folk, that kind of thing. But for me, I was looking at it as if all of these realms are different planetary dimensions. They're all different places. They're all different things with different cosmogonies, with different, stories that started it all. And I went to botany and my study of herbs and flowers and different trees and plants and the life cycle of different trees and plants. And I went, okay, so all those mischievous little fairies, what if they're just violets and daylilies and flowers that have a relatively small lifespan? A nasturtium is around for maybe a couple of weeks. Some daylilies and some flowers might actually blossom and bloom for a day or two. And so they're living their entire life cycle in that day. And so they don't have the time to grow, the same level of logic and thought and philosophy as something like an oak tree, which is going to be around for potentially thousands of years. And so then you look at how the Fae could, develop, and you look at what kind of society can you build when you have some members of it who are all completely kind of subspecies of each other. They're all plants, but they're all very different. But you've got these overlords that are going to be there for thousands of years. And then you've got the little violets and the daylilies and the tiny little flowers and the wildflowers that might be there for a week. And so that's where I got the inspiration for the Fae in the Judge of Mystic saga, way more than I got from, Oberon and Titania in Shakespeare or in a lot of although I do have elements of that as well. But I guess for me, when I have an element like that, like all of a sudden you're in the fairylands and time is different, wink, wink, like it's like, if like that's just literally like, yeah, look, I did the thing. When I think of the things that I like, I think of various forms of artwork. I think of pieces of music. I think of Dido and Aeneas by Henri Purcell. I think of, some of Bach's cantatas. I think I get more inspiration, quote unquote. I get more to guide me into what I need to write next from a piece of music like Mozart's Requiem or the Reprise album by Moby, than I do with a TV show or a series of books or a movie. And I love movies. I am a huge fan of early Ridley Scott films. So Blade Runner, the edit that he finally released many years later and was like, this is the actual edit. Gladiator, Kingdom of Heaven. I think of movies like Bergman's The Seventh Seal. I think of Dreams by Akira Kurosawa, which is a series of his short films all banded together. I think of En Koninklijke Fire, which is a Danish film, which was just the pageantry of it, the emotion of this one specific scene where this is based on a true story. There was a princess of England who became the Queen of Denmark. And she married, the king and found that he was a bit foppish and mentally ill and not exactly the best guy. And so her marriage was just a sham. It was just like, ugh. And they brought a doctor in, Struensee, played by Mads Mikkelsen. And he ended up becoming a very good friend of the queen. And they ended up bringing basically a salon together of a bunch of free thinkers. And they started with, the king befriended Struensee as well. And they started like changing Denmark and adding a lot of very progressive for the time things. This is hundreds of years ago. And Struensee even started developing some of the first, what we would consider as vaccines to start saving some of the population from various diseases that were going around. And they were developing different social programs and different things like that, hundreds of years ago. And it was all going great until the people who had the power wanted to maintain the power. And they realized something very shocking, that Struensee and the queen were lovers. There's this moment where Struensee and the queen are dancing. And the music kind of quiets and you can just see sort of the intensity of it. And them realizing, the sort of like jumping off a roller coaster feeling in your stomach of realizing that they were in love with each other. And the hidden little decision to find a room in the palace that nobody went into, down a hallway that nobody entered, and stealing themselves away. And I think the emotion I got from that sense of hidden passion, that sense of connection, that sense of changing the rules as monarchs when the entire society around them was like, what are you doing? And sure, the common folk were having a better life, but what about the aristocracy? What about this? And eventually, the story ends in a very tragic manner. But that sense of being outside of the theoretical orthodoxy of the time while still living inside of it. You're still living in it. You're still following a lot of those rules, but you're changing the rules in the background. You're attempting to, make decisions with people of power that will actually listen and go there. Like, that is more inspirational to me. That one scene is really cool, with the dance going on into when they eventually have a first very shuddering kiss and they just don't know what to do with themselves and they know what they're doing is wrong. But there's a connection that just doesn't, that doesn't exist in other places. It's something I remember. Let me put it that way. It's something I remember. I think wanting to have people feel similar emotions in my work is where I would go in attaching that kind of thing to inspiration. Not writing a scene like that or even a situation like that, but wanting to inspire various forms of emotion.
We've talked about it before on the podcast. I know we've mentioned it, but if this is your first time here, welcome. If not, and you've just missed it in the past, we have a small joke that Sapha and I are quantum twins because we have a lot of shared experiences in our life without realizing it. A lot of strange similarities, but also like mirror. Like, there are a lot of things, for example, this inspiration where we're complete opposites, but somehow it still feels like it ties in to the same thing in the end, where I think that where my inspiration leads is that I want to take the emotions that my inspiration media, I'll call it, the movies and TV and books and everything that has inspired me to create what I create. And I also want to, like you said, inspire those forms of emotion in the people that are consuming my media. I want them to feel the way that I did when I was consuming that media. So I do think that is the same kind of like,
it's exactly
that's where it all boils. Yeah, it all boils down to the same place. But where it differs is I am the exact opposite, where when I start a project, I sort of collect a list of all the things that I want my project to feel like. And I'll get like a list of like 10 different things, like just short for like Becketville, as I talked about before. Obviously, Fallout is a huge inspiration, but something else that I've been talking about privately recently is some potential rumors that a show called Urinetown might possibly be coming back to Broadway at some point in the future. And that is a very weird, obscure, but big, big inspiration for Becketville. And it's so funny to see how, like, I will take all these little bits where I'm like, for Fallout, like I talked about, I love that big corpo, like you said, a lot of those punk feels in Fallout is very punk. It goes the atom punk route, but I want to take those kind of feels that something is weird, something's wrong, the people who are in charge, something's not right about them. Like, I've always loved that feeling of Fallout and that there's this weird cosmic entity bit of it. Like, I've always loved all those feelings, and I never wanted to take it exactly, although there are a lot of very close similarities in Becketville, but like, the whole vault thing, none of that is a part of Becketville at all. But I do gather a list of like media before I start any project. And I'm like, I really like these vibes from this and this vibe from this. And I like how they did that. And I'll have all these little bits and pieces that I take inspiration from before I start something.
It opens sort of the gateway to the sort of system behind something. Like, especially if you look at film and you're looking at things like Save the Cat. Why was Save the Cat so monumental? Oh, because it's giving you a sort of story arc template that you can then kind of plug and play into. And this was a template that they knew from various audiences over decades that they knew worked. And like with your hero, within the first 30 seconds of your hero being in the thing, you need them to save the cat. What does that mean? It doesn't mean necessarily saving a legitimate, literal cat, but it's a moment where very early on, your protagonist saves something or basically proclaims to themselves that they are the ones, like in the 1950s on TV, they're the ones wearing the white hat. Whereas all the villains wear black hats and come from the right side of the screen to the left. It's like, oh, it's dangerous, it's different, but that was back in an era where TVs were piddly small and you could barely even see anything except stick figures. So white hat, black hat, boom, there you go, there's your characterization. That's how, we can have endless conversations, and we will have endless conversations on how technology has changed storytelling. This is something we are going to do a few episodes on, so hit us up. Go onto our Substack, wearen'tdeadyet.substack.com, and you can post your questions of what you have about the history of technology and how we tell stories. That would be epic.
I'm going to be talking about Sword and Sorcery, a subgenre of fantasy. And the reason I pick it is I had like an epiphany moment like a few weeks ago that everything I've been doing my whole life is sword and sorcery. And it was all about the adventures, making adventures. And I realized that the ones that I really liked making were not the great big epic fantasy campaigns. I realized that those were the ones that, and even my players are like, yeah, sure, we got that. But that's kind of like a plot you have to run in the background that pokes its head out once in a while as you're going along. But what really made the games, what made people keep coming back more and more, is that they were all sword and sorcery. And the reason for that is I found this definition of sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery is a fantasy subgenre that emphasizes small-scale heroic adventures, personal conflicts, and often features a morally ambiguous protagonist navigating a world rich with otherworldly and often medieval or less modern societal influences. They tend to say medieval, but it's not always medieval. There's like a sword and sorcery niche that is like the Japanese version, although it is like their equivalency of medieval. There's another one that is heavy into the Chinese influence. There's another one out there that is very deep into the Filipino history. So although it says medieval, it's not medieval as in just European. It's like that type of level in all sorts of cultures, and people gravitate toward the same essence of it.
When you have various sort of Chinese and Japanese versions of sword and sorcery thing, you have to look at which dynasty was going on in China at the time. They tend to go by dynasty, and then you can kind of see, okay, was it, the Qing dynasty? Was it the Han dynasty? Like where were you at culturally there? And in Japan, was it the shogunate era? Was it pre-shogunate? Are we going back into the Heian era, where you have a lot of the pageantry and things that we might think of with early haiku and with various works of literature that came out of the Heian era aristocracy. So yeah, you have to kind of think of it not from the perspective of, medieval, but over there. No, I think you have to look at what dynasty was it? What era in their history was it? And go with that instead of trying to be like, well, it's like, what was happening in our medieval time? Well, that was 1,000 years.
And then the funny thing is about sword and sorcery is that they say medieval influences. That's what of this definition. But I think it's wrong because a lot of the sword and sorcery goes back further to like the Greek heroes and stuff type.
But that's sword and sandal. There's a specific thing called sword and sandal in a lot of film and creative projects. Sword and sandal is like, Clash of the Titans. It's not sword and sorcery, that's sword and sandal. It's a specific other thing, something like the eagle. That's again, it's sword and sandal. So that's a slightly different thing you could call it, which kind of delineates that kind of thing. When you think of medieval, you're thinking of something after the fall of the Roman Empire. The subgenre sword and sandal was specifically invented in the late 1950s and 60s as the demonym for movies like, Sinbad, for movies like Ben-Hur, Spartacus, Sinbad, Clash of the Titans, all of that. That was specifically developed as pepla.
I just know that there were other people saying well, hey, there's Japanese sword and sorcery, and it's this.
So Japan has its own kind of, sword and sorcery like thing as well. Yeah, you get the fantasy epics. You also get like in Chinese cinema, you get, and pardon my pronunciation, but wuxia, Wuxia. Wuxia is this sort of like fantasy literature based on different kind of warring empires history, sort of warring dynasty history era in China, where they had a lot of martial arts pops up and a lot of martial arts schools come up. So it's this sort of like martial arts fantasy literature. That's specifically called wuxia. And there is a lot of amazing wuxia, which anybody who's seen a Shaw Brothers movie, those ones that are somewhat poorly dubbed, which is an interesting story in and of itself. It was a couple of, British businessmen and British guys that were working in China that had a love for those movies, and they wanted people from the English language world to see them, but they knew that they wouldn't be able to understand the Chinese. So they were like, we love these so much, we're just going to dub them ourselves, And they put their own voices on top of it so that they could share them and things like that. And that's the sort of anecdotal story about those. But yeah, wuxia is an incredible genre of film and comic and literature. It is fantastic. I actually did an interview with one wuxia author who was just fantastic to listen to. I did an interview several years ago with just an incredible author, Fred Yu. He is a Chinese American author, and he writes about a lot of Taoist martial arts, which are really incredible. And then he also wrote novels like The Orchid Farmer's Sacrifice and The Red Crest. He also wrote The Commoner's Destiny and The Legend of Snow Wolf. And those are all works of wuxia literature that have been written in the last few years. Incredible. Go check him out, Fred Yu, and you can look him up at fredyuauthor.com. That is Fred Yu. Go check him out. Just fantastic books. So it is concerning the adventures of martial artists in ancient China, and it usually has some form of historical fantasy involved. And it also can be adapted into that sort of sense of like Chinese opera. And it's just, I love it so much.
When they toss in things like medieval influence and stuff like that, I feel like that's very small, because usually these fantasy worlds tend to take a little bit of here and then, but they're truly fantasy worlds. They're not based purely on like Hercules or any of the, the movies at the time when they were come. For instance, considered one of the first authors is Robert E. Howard, and he wrote all of his Conan the Barbarian series and stuff in the 1930s. And it wasn't until Fritz Leiber came along, and he is credited with coining the term sword and sorcery, but that was much later. And he did the Fafford and the Grey Mouser series. And so this is the written part, but the reason I point these out is they have also become like movies and stuff. But most particularly, like Conan is like the fundamental forefront, where you have the warrior. The warrior is not particular good or evil. They are just them going through and having these adventures. They do have aspects like, well, this is set in a kingdom. It's a fantastical kingdom on a fantastical world or something like that. But that's the closest, I think, to that.
Yeah, it makes sense. And, when you think of the origins of sword and sorcery, as in the origins of the pulp fiction subgenre, which became sword and sorcery, which was developed, in the 30s all the way through the 60s. I mean, Robert E. Howard went on record to say that he was directly inspired by the adventure stories of Jack London and Alexandre Dumas. And so that sense of like, the Three Musketeers and the Man in the Iron Mask, that kind of thing. Those were some of the direct influences of Robert E. Howard when he came to developing Conan the Barbarian and other swashbuckling adventures.
I really wanted was to get into why the key features of the sword and sorcery are so integral to the tabletop role-playing games, especially when you're coming from and how you create things. I mean, I always knew, fantasy stuff. I'll get these fantasy ideas if I watch this movie, read these books or whatever. I'll get a lot of ideas, maybe some plot ideas. But the whole epiphany moment was, why is Sword and Sorcery so essentially at the heart of tabletop role-playing games? And one of the things is, and the most important way to look at that is to look at the key features. Once Conan the Barbarian started getting art, you always would see this muscular warrior with a bladed weapon of some sort, mostly a sword. Sometimes it's an axe. Sometimes it's some other funky weapon. But it's a weapon that they have to use up close and personal. It's not usually a gun. They'll have some weapons that they can shoot at a distance to take care of a distant challenge. But it's always about the hero, the warrior, facing this magical or something empowered with magic with their own wonderful weapon in close quarters, in your face. I'm going to kill you for whatever, that type of thing. Even though it's almost always like this great male warrior, they weren't all male warriors. There were female warriors doing the same thing. For instance, there was a Gyro of Joyry by Seal Moore. And when it comes to film, I think the biggest known one would be the Red Sonja, where Arnold Schwarzenegger came as Conan and a friend, and they was with Red Sonja on her adventure, assisting her. But there's always some kind of beefcake or muscly warrior, especially in the films. This is where this really came out. It was a thing. When it came to the 80s, all of a sudden there were these half-naked men with these weapons. And then, of course, women are scantily clad. There's a lot of skin on all sides.
There's a lot of skin because pulp fiction is about titivation. There's sex and rock and roll. You think of a lot of the rock and roll and the heavy metal band covers of the 70s going into the 80s. Jack Black did a really cool video with Good Mythical Morning about, those covers and things like that. But he looked specifically at the art and they're like, okay, yeah, what artist is this? What happened? So definitely look up Jack Black if you want more on that. But yeah, you get this sort of, sex and rock and roll, chiseled muscles, aspirational, way too chiseled for most people. But it's all about that easy pulp money, which, is by nature exploitative. That is just, you're creating Arnold oiled up on screen. You are meant to ogle at those muscles. That is the nature of it. That's why it's there. He agreed to that. It was absolutely consented to and agreed to. So bring on the muscles.
They're all like not the greatest quality. They're not like grade A movies. They're like all in the B series. I lived in the B series. I mean, that was like my movies all the time. After midnight movies, after dark. That's where they put a lot of these at first back in the day. So there's like all those who grew up in the 80s. Yeah. Hey guys, remember the TV back in the day when we only had 4 stations at most. So our viewing was limited. We took whatever we could get. But leading back into exactly Sword and Sorcery, you can find a lot of inspiration in anything Sword and Sorcery because the stories are written in such a way that they give you the hook to draw your players in, as well as the actual plot that you can point out and then your players can go through it after. You take a character's backstory, one of your players' backstories, you find something in there that they might want to avenge. Next up, you get stealing precious items. I don't know about you, but player characters, they're not like, oh, we shouldn't steal that. How many games have you played where you go smashing into something and you take the stuff because it's there?
I think you've got something there where it's involved, we have very strong laws, in a lot of areas in this world where, it's not okay to go steal things or take something that doesn't belong to you or walk into a museum and walk out with a bunch of priceless art and then hoof it on the side of the road for somebody named Steve. That's not okay. But you can live vicariously with various decisions that you would not make, in these games. And I think, too, that's one of the things in video games that the Avatar was created to do, was basically inspect what your morality turns into when the consequences are gone. Because there's no consequences for you as a real life person in the game when you're playing it. I mean, there are consequences that happen to the character, but it's not like if your character assassinates the drogue of blah blah's daughter in game, it doesn't mean that you are going to go to prison for murder. That's, so it gives the ability for somebody to kind of escape themselves for a while, which is the purpose of pulp literature and also the purpose of Sword and Sorcery, which is escapism. And there's a lot of Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Sandal and a lot of basically pulp, that was specifically invented to be easy, sexy, bring it on, quick to make, follows the same rules, titivate and get out, almost interchangeable stories where you have the same vibe, the same kind of sensation, which was meant to just be easy to enjoy. And then you close it up and go, oh, that was great. Where's the next one?
Yeah. And that's the whole thing about Sword and Sorcery when you're writing the stories. They're already called adventures. While the adventures are grounded, they are far from mundane. Heroes emerge not from global events that shake the heavens, but from the tremors that shake a single soul to its core. And this is why your players keep coming back. Because what they want to do is they want to experience this fantastic world through their little character. And so that's what I think it makes it really imperative to study the Sword and Sorcery genre in the books and the movies and stuff. Because you will find it very enlightening in how to hook your players into your plot and how to run the plot. For instance, Conan, the 2 Conan movies. It starts off where there are these raiders that come in. There's this big bad guy that comes in with his mace, this heavy mace, and he just bangs, it's a really heavy weapon. And he kills people with it, and he actually kills his father, the blacksmith, with this mace. And then he just takes the boy with a bunch of the other children, and he's working at this mill area, and the raider and his company are gone. He just brought him to his people of the region that he controls, and so now he's there working. And forgotten about. It was just a boy, one of the trophies he got from destroying all the people in his village, and brings him back. And so it goes on farther and farther, and he starts hearing things, and he faces somebody who has his father's sword, the broken sword of his father. They're still using it, kind of like filed it the edge down to make it more of a dagger, but a broken sword of his father. So he gets that, and he gets to fix it, but he fixes it with the secrets, and it makes it really super strong. So now he has the full sword. So now this raider cap, the leader of these raiders, he is now this big leader, and he's controlling them with religion and belief and mysticism and magic, because he's swirled it all together. These people are going to follow him because he's not just this big, strong warrior, and he's a really big, strong guy. James Earl Jones, by the way. And so he's a big guy, he's got this, but he now has power. And, and he gets bigger and more powerful, and then it goes into the second movie, and it's even bigger and more. It's just fantastic how you do that. That's all you do. You just, okay, this leader, he's going to escape. You didn't get to kill him. He rode off for whatever reason. Now he's going to come back, and now he's going to have, he's got minions, and some of them have magic. And now he has magic because they enchanted this, that, or the other thing. This guy's getting more and more powerful with mysticism and might, because that's the sorcery part of Sword and Sorcery. And Conan himself was getting more powerful. He finally got a special weapon. He ended up in a cave, which ended up to be the tomb of this ancient warrior. And he had this vision of these spirits, and he took the sword of this ancient warrior. Yeah, they just added twists and turns. And that's what you do in your stories. You do the same thing. So if you're wondering why there's all these weird twists and turns in Sword and Sorcery tales, just chalk it up to, hey, imagine if you had your own adventure party doing all that. And that's probably where one of the twists comes in with what I'm doing with Blackstone, is all these plots that don't seem to go together at first really do go together in the longer form of the plot. But they have to start somewhere, and you don't see the tie, but you do have to know that they exist, because not only do they add tension and stuff like that, but they have to lead somewhere. And there's a reason why some of the subplots, like in Blackstone, don't end when Blackstone ends. They're still carrying on. So it's kind of like an arching subplot that is still smaller than the arching story arc, which is still smaller than the big campaign arc. And another thing that a lot of these will almost always have is some kind of romantic subplot. What it is the warrior has this love for this other person who is helping them. Maybe they're even partners. It's almost always the other person is almost equal in their own way, in a different way, but still significant. Women that were independent, skilled, striking in their own way, and they weren't the typical housewife type, the meek. They were not that kind of woman. They were in themselves, they're a type of warrior, a thief, a mage. So they were seen as an equal with their own set of skills type thing. They're not seen as just to be the significant other. They're not just, insert lover of choice here because this is what we need for the story. They have to have a part in the story beyond that. They're not just the lover. They're much more, which is why I always really like these type of stories, I think. And sometimes in these stories, it is the hero that falls into bad times, and it's the lover that comes to save the hero, and then they go back up. So, yeah. And the biggest thing about Sword and Sorcery is there's action and adventure, and it fills up a big bulk of the story. Exploring, going through dangerous situations, and testing your character's abilities. Probably the second most vital part of Sword and Sorcery is the magic. It's not going to be Sword and Sorcery if you don't have magic.
Thus the sorcery of Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah. And that's where the sword part, the sword just means a weapon of close combat. There could be various things that are not swords, and you can still use them in close combat. They essentially do the same thing. There was this one movie, I can't remember what it was like, there's this guy who had a tri-blade sword. This had to take a really probably pretty strong actor to swing this thing around. This sword that had 3 blades.
They're made of foam. Only the hero swords are metal in a film. Usually they are made of plastic cast or they're foam. So for Lord of the Rings, let's take a look at that. They did actually make actual metal swords, and, Viggo Mortensen was famous for keeping his around a whole lot and, learning how to swing it. And he wore it for a while. And they were like, whoa, hey, what are you doing here on the streets of New Zealand with a sword? He's like, I'm sorry, I'm filming a movie. I'm just trying to learn how to work. I need it to feel natural, like that kind of thing. But usually when they're in a fight scene or when they're actually filming something in film, they're using prop weapons, which are plastic or foam. Sometimes I've even seen people cast things like that with hot glue, and then it's reusable because they can just melt it at the end and then reuse the materials. It's pretty fun, but it's very rare that you'll actually have the metal on metal unless there's a specific close-up. So yeah, sorry to, he didn't have to be necessarily ridiculously strong. It was probably made out of plastic.
No, don't break my heart. I mean, that looks so awesome.
And with that, all you rebels, writers, and gamers, we're wrapping up another mind-bending episode of We Aren't Dead Yet, your go-to for all things TTRPG and speclit. Stay wild, curious, and keep defying the ordinary. Until next time, hit up WADY at vraedamedia.ca/WADY. That's VRAEYDAMEDIA.ca/WADY. Like and subscribe, share with your friends, check out our merch store. We'll see you next week for more news, views, and hullabaloos. So keep the fires burning, the dice rolling, and the pages turning. And remember, there's always something we can do, because we aren't dead yet.